They say that the perfect crime leaves no trace, but what if the trace was there all along, buried in a lost voicemail and hidden beneath the floorboards of a rundown farmhouse? We all know the official story: the tapas dinner, the open window, and the little girl who vanished into thin air. But what if the danger wasn't a stranger passing through, but a ghost who had been watching from the shadows for weeks? What if the man who holds the answer didn't just steal a life, but lived among the search parties, laughing at the chaos he created from a terrifying collection of videotapes that revealed a predator's true face to a drunken confession at a music festival that exposed an 18-year secret? She did not scream. This is the story of the clues that were missed, the witness who was ignored, and the drifter who turned a paradise into a hunting ground. We are about to open the files that sat gathering dust while a family grieved and exposed the chilling reality of Christian Brueckner. If you are ready to look into the eyes of the prime suspect and hear the testimony that finally broke the silence, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. You do not want to miss the truth that has been hiding in plain sight. The evening of the 3rd of May 2007 began with a deception of safety. It was the kind of night that felt suspended in time, wrapped in the cool spring air of the Portuguese coast, where the rhythm of a holiday lull masked the proximity of danger. For the families gathered at the tapas restaurant, the world had shrunk to the radius of their table, the clinking of wine glasses and the low hum of conversation. They sat just a short distance from where their children slept, a distance that felt negligible, manageable, and safe. It was a routine they had established over the previous days, a system of checks and assurances that relied on the belief that the resort was a sanctuary. But the sanctuary was porous, and the darkness outside the perimeter of the restaurant lights was not empty. Inside apartment 5, the silence was heavy. It was not the peaceful silence of deep sleep, but a stillness that would later be dissected by investigators, journalists, and forensic experts for decades. 3 children lay in the room. The twins were in travel cots, breathing rhythmically in the center of the room. The eldest, a young toddler, lay in the bed against the wall. The room was dark, save for the faint ambient light filtering in from the complex. The parents had left the apartment via the patio doors, leaving them unlocked to allow for their regular checks. It was a decision born of convenience and a false sense of security, a decision that would become the focal point of a million conversations in the years to follow. At roughly 5 minutes past 9 o'clock in the evening, the father left the table to conduct his check. He walked the short distance from the restaurant to the ground floor apartment. The night was crisp. He entered through the patio doors. The apartment was quiet. He moved to the bedroom door, which had been left slightly ajar to let light spill in from the living area. He listened. He heard nothing but the soft breathing of sleep. He peered into the gloom and saw the shapes of his 3 children. Everything appeared to be in order. He noticed that the door was slightly wider open than he remembered leaving it, but in the casual logic of a holiday, he dismissed it. Perhaps a draft, perhaps a trick of memory. He did not step fully inside. He did not turn on a light. He felt the reassurance of their presence and turned back, returning to the dinner table, unaware that he had just stood on the precipice of a crime that was likely already unfolding or was mere moments away from completion. While the father returned to his meal, a different timeline was playing out in the shadows. The resort was not merely populated by tourists and staff. It was a hunting ground for those who knew how to navigate its blind spots. The layout of the Ocean Club was open, accessible from public roads with low walls and alleyways that offered cover for anyone wishing to remain unseen. A predator does not need to be invisible. They only need to be unnoticed. The man who would later become the primary focus of German prosecutors knew this geography intimately. He knew the rhythms of the tourists, the predictable schedules of the dinner service, and the vulnerability of the ground floor units. He was not a ghost. He was a mechanic, a drifter, a man who blended into the background of the Algarve, driving his camper van through the dusty roads, watching and waiting. Around the same time the father was checking the room, a family friend also left the table to check on his own children in a neighboring apartment. As he walked up the street, he noticed a man walking away from the direction of apartment 5A. The man was carrying a child. At the time, the sight did not register as an alarm. It was a holiday resort, Parents carried sleeping children home from dinner every night. The man walked with purpose, but without panic, disappearing into the darkness. This sighting would later become one of the most critical and contested pieces of evidence in the investigation. Was this the abductor, or was it merely another tourist, an innocent bystander caught in the net of suspicion? The witness described the man as average height, wearing casual clothes, holding the child awkwardly. The child appeared to be asleep. The encounter lasted only seconds, but those seconds would be replayed in the mind of the witness for the rest of his life. Back at the table, the laughter continued. The group was in high spirits, enjoying the penultimate night of their vacation. The timeline ticked forward relentlessly. It was now 10 o'clock. It was the mother's turn to check. She stood up, leaving the warmth of the group, and walked the familiar path back to the apartment. The air had grown colder. She reached the patio doors and slid them open. The living room was exactly as her husband had left it. She walked toward the bedroom. The moment she reached the door, the atmosphere shifted. The door, which her husband had noted was slightly ajar, was now slammed open, seemingly by a strong gust of wind. She stepped forward to close it to prevent the draft from waking the children. As she gripped the handle, her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the room. She looked at the beds. The twins were there, sleeping soundly in their cots. She looked at the bed against the wall. It was empty. For a fraction of a second, the mind rejects trauma. She assumed the child had woken up and wandered into the parents' bed in the other room. She turned and checked the master bedroom. It was empty. She checked the bathroom. Empty. A cold spike of adrenaline began to rise in her chest, a physical reaction that precedes the conscious realization of disaster. She returned to the children's bedroom. She looked at the bed again. The duvet was pulled back. The favorite soft toy, a pink cat, was lying on the bed, but the child was gone. Then she noticed the window. The window, which had been shut, was now open. The external shutters, which were heavy and difficult to lift from the outside, were raised all the way up. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The draft that had slammed the door was not random. It was caused by the cross breeze between the open window and the open patio door. Someone had been in the room. Someone had opened that window. Someone had taken her daughter. She ran back to the patio doors, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She needed to raise the alarm, but the shock had stolen her voice. She forced herself to run back to the restaurant, her legs feeling heavy and unresponsive. As she approached the table, the faces of her friends turned toward her, expecting a smile or a wave. Instead, they saw a face contorted in absolute terror. She screamed a sentence that would echo through the media for decades. "They have taken her." The table erupted into chaos. Chairs were scraped back, glasses were knocked over. The group rushed to the apartment, fueled by a desperate hope that she was wrong, that the child was hiding, that this was a mistake. They tore through the small apartment, checking cupboards, looking under beds, searching the small garden area. They ran into the street, shouting her name. The silence of the resort was shattered. Lights flickered on in neighboring apartments as other guests woke up to the commotion. The illusion of the safe holiday was instantly vaporized. The staff of the Ocean Club were alerted. The protocols for a missing child were initiated, but they were protocols designed for a wandering toddler, not a criminal vanishing. The receptionists, young and untrained for a major crime scene, tried to help. People began to trample through the apartment, searching, destroying potential forensic evidence with every footstep. In the panic, the crime scene was contaminated before the police were even called. The window, the shutters, the bedding surfaces that might have held fingerprints or DNA were touched by frantic parents and friends. The local police, the Guardia Nacional Republicana, were summoned. They arrived later than expected, and the language barrier created an immediate wall of confusion. They, too, initially operated under the assumption that the child had wandered off and fallen perhaps into a construction trench or a pool. The idea of a predator entering a family apartment and snatching a child while the parents were 50 yards away seemed impossible to them. Valuable hours were lost in these early misconceptions. The perimeter was not sealed. The roads leading out of the village of Praia de Luz remained open. A vehicle could have driven out of the Algarve and into Spain before a single roadblock was established. As the night deepened into the early hours of the 4th of May, the search widened. Staff and tourists formed lines combing the scrubland surrounding the resort. They called out her name into the darkness, their voices carried away by the wind. But the darkness gave nothing back. The predator, whoever he was, had a head start. He had the advantage of surprise, the advantage of the night, and the advantage of a chaotic response. While the search parties scanned the ground with flashlights, a different reality was setting in for the investigators who would later review the case. They would look back at this night, not as a tragedy of bad luck, but as a crime of opportunity executed with chilling precision. The timeline suggested that the abductor had been watching. He knew when the parents left. He knew the layout. He knew exactly how much time he had between checks. This was not a random act. It was a calculated extraction. German authorities would later pinpoint the movements of Christian Brueckner on this very night. His cell phone would ping off a tower near the resort just an hour before the disappearance. He was there. He was close. The man who had once told an associate that he liked to break into holiday homes because the tourists left things behind was in the vicinity. But on this night, he did not take money or jewelry. The theory that began to form was far darker. He had entered the apartment perhaps intending to burgle it, and had found something else. Or perhaps the burglary was never the motive at all. The night wore on agonizingly slow. The parents were separated for questioning their grief, compounded by the rigid procedures of the police. They sat in a room, the weight of the empty bed pressing down on them. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of Praia de Luz. The shadow in the Algarve had struck, and he had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. The village, usually a place of sun and leisure, had transformed into a trap. Every car that passed, every stranger's face, was now a source of suspicion. By dawn, the news had begun to spread, first to the British media, then to the world. The disappearance of a young daughter from a safe holiday resort struck a primal chord of fear in parents everywhere. It was the ultimate nightmare, the child taken from her bed while the parents were just outside. But as the sun rose over the ocean, casting a golden light over the resort, the reality remained cold and stark. The shutter was up. The window was open. And Madeleine was gone. The investigation that launched that morning would span continents and decades. It would involve thousands of leads, millions of pounds, and countless theories. But everything traced back to those critical minutes in the dark, the window of time between the father's check and the mother's discovery. In that narrow slice of time, a life was stolen. And somewhere in the distance, a man in a camper van was moving through the night, carrying a secret that he would keep for 18 years. The witness, Helga Bushing, was miles away, unaware that the man she knew, the man she had seen stealing diesel and hiding videotapes, was now the center of a mystery that would haunt the world. The pieces were all there. The drifter, the phone signal, the history of intrusion, but it would take years for them to be assembled into a picture of the suspect. For now, there was only the empty room and the screaming silence of a child who was no longer there. This was the beginning of the long wait. The beginning of the questions that would never fully be answered. The beginning of the hunt for a man who claimed to be a ghost, but who left footprints in the lives of everyone he touched. The vanishing was complete, but the story of the man in the shadows was only just beginning to emerge from the dark. While the searchlights swept the empty scrubland and the parents stood paralyzed by the sudden void in their lives, the man who would eventually become the focus of the world's suspicion was already moving through his own separate reality. He was a man who understood the power of invisibility. In the bustling tourist economy of the Algarve, he was a fixture that no one truly saw. To the locals, he was the German mechanic with the greasy hands and the beat-up vehicles. To the expats, he was a useful acquaintance who could fix a radiator or repair a roof for a fraction of the market price. To the tourists, he was simply part of the background, as insignificant as the waiters or the street cleaners. But this anonymity was his greatest weapon. It allowed him to exist in the spaces between society watching without being watched, taking without being caught. Christian Brueckner lived a life defined by transience. He did not belong to the polished world of the family resorts with their swimming pools and evening entertainment. His world was the dust of the backroads and the isolation of the countryside. His home was a dual existence. Sometimes he resided in a dilapidated farmhouse, a structure isolated enough to keep secrets hidden away from the prying eyes of neighbors. At other times, his life was contained within the metal shell of a camper van. This vehicle was more than transport. It was a mobile fortress. It allowed him to change his location on a whim, to vanish from one village and reappear in another, leaving no trail of utility bills or rental agreements. It was the perfect vessel for a man who lived by the logic of a predator: never stay in one place long enough to be pinned down. He had arrived in Portugal years earlier, drifting south away from legal troubles in his homeland. The Algarve offered him a restart, a place where the sun was constant, and the authorities were often relaxed, unaccustomed to the kind of calculated criminality he brought with him. He funded his lifestyle through a combination of odd jobs and theft. He was a scavenger. He knew that the holidaymakers who flooded the region every summer brought with them a wealth of carelessness. They left windows open to catch the breeze. They left cameras and wallets on patio tables. They assumed that the relaxed atmosphere of their vacation extended to the laws of the street. Brueckner knew better. He knew that paradise was the easiest place to steal because no one expected a wolf in a place designed for sheep. His connection to the Ocean Club was not a matter of chance. It was a matter of history. He had worked in the area. He had been employed to do maintenance work, fixing the mundane mechanics of the resort infrastructure. This gave him a privilege that few outsiders possessed: knowledge of the layout. He knew which pathways were lit and which were cast in shadow. He knew the shift patterns of the security staff. He knew that the ground floor apartments, while convenient for families with young children and strollers, were also the most vulnerable to intrusion. He understood the architecture of the place, not as a guest, but as a technician. He saw the weak points in the locks, the blind spots in the surveillance, and the easy escape routes that led into the maze of streets surrounding the complex. In the weeks leading up to that fateful May evening, his behavior had been erratic but calculated. He was living on the edge, surviving on the proceeds of drug dealing and burglary. His associates knew him as a man with a short fuse, a man who could switch from charming to menacing in the blink of an eye. But they also knew him as a man who could get things. If you needed diesel, he could siphon it. If you needed a car part, he could find it. This utility kept him insulated within a small circle of fellow drifters and criminals, a subculture that operated beneath the surface of the tourist industry. They adhered to a code of silence, a mutual agreement to look the other way, which provided him with a layer of protection that the police would later struggle to penetrate. On the day of the disappearance, he was not a distant figure. He was dangerously close. Phone records would later place his device in the immediate vicinity of the Ocean Club. He received a phone call early in the evening, a conversation that lasted for half an hour. The person on the other end of the line was never fully identified as a suspect, but the timing was critical. He was there, hovering on the perimeter, a shadow waiting for the sun to go down. The investigation would later theorize that he was scouting. He was looking for an opportunity. Perhaps he intended to break into an empty apartment to steal cash or electronics, a routine crime that he had committed dozens of times before. But something changed that night. The psychological profile constructed by detectives years later suggested a shift in motivation. Brueckner was not just a thief. He was a man with deep, disturbing pathologies. He harbored interests that went far beyond material gain. The police knew he had a history of crimes involving the exploitation of the vulnerable. He had been convicted before. He was on the radar of the German justice system, but in Portugal he was a free agent. The intersection of his criminal intent and the vulnerability of Apartment 5 created a catastrophic alignment of circumstances. As the families dined and the staff went about their evening routines, Brueckner was moving through the dark. He did not drive a flashy car that would attract attention. He drove vehicles that blended in: older models, battered vans, cars that looked like they belonged to a local worker. This camouflage allowed him to park on side streets without drawing a second glance. He could sit in his car smoking and watching, and to a passerby he was just a man taking a break. No one looked closely at the driver. No one memorized the license plate. He relied on the apathy of strangers. The narrative of his life in the Algarve was one of escalation. He had started with small thefts, stealing fuel and tools. Then he graduated to holiday homes entering while the occupants were out rifling through their luggage. There were incidents where he was nearly caught, moments where he had to flee into the night, but he always escaped. These near misses did not deter him. They emboldened him. He began to feel untouchable. He believed he was smarter than the local police, sharper than the tourists. This arrogance was a defining trait. It was the same arrogance that would one day lead him to boast to a friend at a festival, a slip of the tongue that would ultimately unravel his 18 years of silence. But on that night in May, the arrogance was disciplined. He was focused. The apartment at the corner of the block offered perfect cover. It was accessible from the street. The shrubbery provided a screen. The patio doors were visible. He could see the movements of the parents. He could see when they left. He could see when they returned. He measured the intervals. He calculated the risk. The window of opportunity was narrow, but for a man who had spent years mastering the art of intrusion, it was wide enough. He was the ghost in the machine of the resort. While the parents checked their watches, ensuring they were responsible, checking every 20 minutes, he was operating on a different clock. He knew that 20 minutes was a lifetime for a professional thief. In 20 minutes, a window could be jimmied, a room could be tossed, and a predator could vanish. The tragedy was that the parents were guarding against accidents, a child waking up, a fall, a fever. They were not guarding against a human being who had been studying their routine. They were prepared for bad luck, not for malice. As the night deepened, the man in the camper van prepared to move. He was not acting on impulse. He was acting on instinct, the instinct of a hunter who spots a separated member of the herd. The ordinary world of the resort was about to collide with the dark, hidden world of Christian Brueckner. He stepped out of the shadows and crossed the line between the observer and the intruder. In doing so, he altered the course of history for everyone involved. He did not just steal a child, he stole the peace of mind of an entire generation of parents. And as he slipped away into the night, leaving the chaos behind him, he returned to his camouflage, confident that he was just another face in the crowd, a mechanic, a drifter, a nobody that no one would ever suspect. In the shadow economy of the Algarve, trust was a currency far more valuable than the euro. It was a world where questions were rarely asked, and answers were even more scarcely given. Helga Bushing navigated this world with a hardened pragmatism. She was not a tourist seeking the sun, she was a survivor operating on the fringes of the resort towns. Her life intersected with Christian Brueckner not through friendship, but through necessity and mutual benefit. They were associates in the truest sense of the criminal underground, bound together by the need for quick cash and the adrenaline of petty theft. Their partnership was built on the mundane mechanics of survival crimes. They stole diesel fuel to keep their vehicles running. They lifted solar panels to sell for scrap or reuse. They dealt in small quantities of illicit substances, moving just enough product to get by, but trying to stay below the radar of the Portuguese authorities. To Helga, Brueckner was a useful tool. He was mechanically inclined, capable of fixing the battered engines of their vans, and he possessed a reckless confidence that made him effective at acquiring things they needed. However, there was an unease that permeated their interactions. Helga was no stranger to the rougher edges of life, but Brueckner carried a different kind of energy. He could be charming, flashing a smile that disarmed those who did not know him, but the charm was a thin veneer. Beneath it lay a volatility that put Helga on edge. He spoke of his conquests and his thefts with a disturbing lack of empathy. He viewed the world as a collection of objects to be taken, and people were often just obstacles in his path. They spent hours driving through the back roads between Praia da Luz and Lagos, scanning the landscape for opportunities. During these drives, Brueckner would sometimes point out holiday villas, noting which ones had weak security or which ones were currently occupied by wealthy tourists. He had a catalog of targets in his mind. Helga listened, filing away the information, but she kept a psychological distance. She knew that men like Brueckner were dangerous, not just to their victims, but to their accomplices. If he went down, he would drag everyone else with him. The dynamic shifted subtly over time. Helga began to notice that Brueckner's activities were not limited to fuel and hardware. He had a stash of items that did not fit the profile of a mechanic or scrap dealer. There were hints of a darker appetite, a predatory nature that went beyond simple greed. He would disappear for stretches of time, returning with unexplained cash or items that seemed out of place in his rough lifestyle. Helga suspected he was breaking into homes not just for goods, but for the thrill of the invasion itself. But in their world, you did not press for details. You took your cut, you filled your tank, and you looked the other way. It was a silence she would later come to regret, a silence that allowed a predator to roam free in a paradise full of unsuspecting families. The location was a farmhouse, isolated and unassuming, sitting roughly 1 mile from the meticulously manicured grounds of the Ocean Club. It was a place that did not want to be found. The road leading to it was rough, a dirt track that discouraged casual traffic. This was where Christian Brueckner kept the parts of his life he wanted to keep hidden. To the outside observer, it was just another rundown property in the rural Algarve. To Helga Bushing, it was a target. It was 2006, a year before the world would learn the name of the missing British girl. Brueckner was away, likely on one of his trips back to Germany or scouting a new location. Helga and another acquaintance saw an opportunity. They knew Brueckner hoarded fuel at the farmhouse. They were low on diesel, and in their circle there was no honor among thieves. Stealing from an associate was fair game if you did not get caught. They drove up the track, the dust billowing behind their vehicle. The farmhouse sat silent in the heat. There was no sign of the dogs Brueckner sometimes kept, violent animals that he used for intimidation. The coast was clear. They approached the structure with the caution of people who knew the owner was capable of violence. They checked the windows. The house was secure but not impenetrable. They forced their way in, intending to grab the fuel canisters and leave within minutes. Once inside, the atmosphere of the house hit them immediately. It was not a home. It was a storage unit for a chaotic mind. The place was a mess. It was filthy, cluttered with the detritus of a transient life. But amidst the trash and the dirty dishes, there were piles of items that did not belong there. It looked like the aftermath of a dozen burglaries. There were suitcases stacked in corners. There were personal items scattered everywhere, specifically clothing that did not belong to him. It was not just old laundry, it was an assortment of sizes and styles, the kind of wardrobe one would find in the suitcases of tourists. Helga moved through the rooms, stepping over debris. The air smelled stale. The sheer volume of tourist stuff was alarming. There were cameras, passports, and electronics. It became clear that Brueckner was not just stealing diesel from trucks. He was systematically raiding the temporary homes of visitors. He was bringing the spoils of his invasions back to this lair. The house felt heavy with the presence of absent victims. Every item represented a violation of someone's privacy. They found the fuel they were looking for, but the curiosity of the thief took over. They began to rifle through the other items, looking for anything of high value that they could easily sell. Helga opened drawers and boxes. It was a treasure trove of stolen memories. But as she dug deeper into the chaos of the farmhouse, the feeling of dread intensified. This was not the stash of a simple burglar. This was the collection of a man who took trophies. The disorder of the house mirrored the disorder of his mind, and Helga was standing right in the center of it. In the corner of the living area, amidst the clutter, Helga found a video camera. It was a standard camcorder, the type used by families to record holidays. Beside it were several tapes. In the criminal world, information is power, and Helga wondered if the tapes contained evidence of where Brueckner had stashed money or drugs. Driven by a mix of greed and curiosity, she decided to check the content. She inserted a tape and pressed play. The footage that flickered onto the small screen was grainy, but the images were unmistakably clear. It was not footage of a family holiday. It was not a recording of a landscape. It was a recording of a crime in progress. Helga watched her breath catching in her throat. The camera had been set up on a tripod or a steady surface positioned to capture the entire room. The scene depicted a man and a woman. The woman was an elderly individual clearly in distress. She was bound. The man in the frame was dressed in black, his movements aggressive and controlling. He was wearing a mask that obscured his face, a dark covering that turned him into a faceless monster. The video documented a severe assault. The violence was not performative. It was real, cold, and methodical. Helga watched in stunned silence, unable to look away from the horror playing out on the tiny screen. As the tape continued, the assault concluded. The man in the video, exhausted and sweating from the physical exertion of the crime, sat down on the edge of the bed. He seemed to forget the camera was rolling, or perhaps he did not care. He reached up and pulled the mask off his head. The face that stared back from the recording was undeniable. It was Christian Brueckner. Helga froze. The realization washed over her like ice water. She was not just dealing with a thief who stole solar panels. She was associating with a dangerous criminal who targeted vulnerable people in their own homes. The elderly woman in the video was later identified as an American tourist, 72 years old, who had been attacked in her villa in Praia da Luz. Brueckner had recorded his own crime, keeping the tape as a sick souvenir of the act. She ejected the tape, her hands trembling. She found another tape. She played it. This one was even more harrowing. It showed a young individual barely out of childhood. The content was similar evidence of severe harm and control. The victim was German. Brueckner was documenting a history of depravity that spanned ages and nationalities. Helga looked around the messy farmhouse with new eyes. The women's clothes were not just stolen laundry, they were trophies. The luggage was not just loot, it was the residue of destroyed lives. The fear that gripped her was primal. She was standing in the den of a monster. If he walked in through the door at that moment, she knew she would not leave the farmhouse alive. He could not afford for anyone to see what she had just seen. She grabbed the fuel they had come for, but she left the tapes. She was too terrified to take them, too terrified to have that evidence in her possession. To take them would be to declare war on a man she now knew was capable of anything. She signaled to her partner that they had to leave immediately. They scrambled out of the house, locking the door behind them, trying to leave no trace of their intrusion. As they drove away, speeding down the dirt track back toward civilization, Helga felt a profound sickness. The image of Brueckner taking off the mask was burned into her retina. He had looked so casual, so indifferent to the suffering he had just inflicted. She knew a dangerous secret now. Christian Brueckner was not a mechanic. He was a predator who hunted in the dark, and he was living right in the middle of the community, invisible and lethal. The silence she had kept before was no longer just a criminal code. It was now a matter of her own survival. She had seen the face behind the mask, and she knew that face would haunt her nightmares for years to come. The year was 2008, 12 months after the disappearance that had frozen the world's attention. The location was a music festival in Spain, a sprawling event where the noise of the crowds and the rhythm of the bass provided a chaotic shelter for those who lived on the fringes. For most attendees, the festival was an escape, a weekend of hedonism and music under the Spanish sun. But for Helga, Bushing and the circle of drifters she associated with it was merely another stop on a restless map, a place to blend in, to sell illicit goods, and to exist without the scrutiny of the law. Christian Brueckner was there. He moved through the festival grounds with the swagger of a man who felt untouchable. He was driving a large camper van, a vehicle that served as both his transport and his fortress. To the casual observer, he was just another festival goer, perhaps a bit rougher around the edges, but unremarkable. However, Helga saw him differently now. Since the day in the farmhouse 2 years prior, when she had watched the videotapes, she had viewed him through a lens of fear and revulsion. She knew what he was capable of when the masks came off. She knew the violence that lay dormant beneath his mechanic's grease and casual demeanor. They found themselves sitting together in the evening, surrounded by the haze of smoke and the distant thrum of the stage. The alcohol was flowing, loosening tongues and lowering guards. In their world, conversations often revolved around money, the police, and the next job. But that year, there was only one topic that dominated every newspaper and television screen in Europe: the missing British girl. The case had become a global obsession. The face of the child was plastered on posters from the Algarve to Berlin. It was the mystery that defied explanation, the crime that had no witnesses and no leads. Helga watched Brueckner closely. She saw the arrogance in his posture. He was a man who took pride in his intelligence, in his ability to outsmart the authorities. The Portuguese police were being criticized daily in the press for their lack of progress, and Brueckner seemed to relish their incompetence. He made disparaging remarks about the investigation, mocking the efforts of the detectives who were chasing shadows. It was a dangerous game he was playing, sitting there in the open, criticizing the hunt for a predator while hiding his own dark history. The conversation drifted closer to the specifics of the case. Helga, emboldened perhaps by the drink or perhaps by a gnawing need to know the truth, decided to steer the discussion toward the logistics of the vanishing. She wanted to provoke him to see if the mask would slip. She mentioned the rewards being offered, the theories about international trafficking, the suspicion falling on the parents. Brueckner listened, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He seemed amused by the speculation, like a magician watching an audience try to guess the trick. The tension between them was palpable, at least to Helga. She was sitting next to a man she knew to be a monster, a man who had videotaped his own crimes against women. Yet here he was, drinking beer and laughing at the world. She felt a cold knot in her stomach. She wondered if he had been in Praia da Luz that night. She wondered if his mockery of the police was rooted in the satisfaction of having beaten them. The noise of the festival roared around them, a wall of sound that isolated their conversation, creating a private bubble where dangerous secrets could be whispered. The night had deepened and the conversation had stripped away the usual pleasantries. Helga looked at Brueckner, studying his face for a flicker of guilt or anxiety. There was none. There was only a cold, detached confidence. She decided to press him. She needed to understand how such a crime could be committed without a trace. The media had obsessed over the timeline, the window of opportunity, the silence of the act. "I do not understand," Helga said, keeping her voice steady, trying to sound like she was just pondering a puzzle. "How can someone go into a hotel apartment with the parents just down the road and take a child? How can you carry a child out without them waking up, without them crying out?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air between them. Surely the little one would have screamed. Surely someone would have heard something. Brueckner took a drink, his eyes scanning the crowd before returning to her. He looked at her with a strange intensity, a look that suggested he knew something the rest of the world did not. The alcohol had eroded his filter. The arrogance that defined him, the need to be the smartest person in the room, overpowered his instinct for self-preservation. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "She did not scream," he said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a confession. Helga froze. Her mind raced to process what he had just said. He had not said maybe she was asleep or perhaps they drugged her. He had spoken with absolute certainty. He had spoken in the past tense, as a witness, as a participant. She did not scream. The implication was terrifying. It meant he was there. It meant he knew the state of the child at the moment of the vanishing. It implied a level of control, a specific memory of the event. Helga stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to maintain her composure, tried not to show the horror that was flooding her system. She asked him, "How do you know that?" The question seemed to snap him out of his trance. Brueckner blinked, realizing instantly that he had crossed a line. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a flash of suspicion. He saw the look in her eyes and realized he had said too much. The bravado evaporated. He did not answer her question. Instead, he stood up abruptly. The casual atmosphere was shattered. "I have to go," he muttered, turning away from her. He disappeared into the crowd, moving quickly, putting distance between himself and the witness to his slip. Helga sat alone in the noise of the festival, the sentence echoing in her mind. She did not scream. It was a chilling detail, intimate and horrific. It transformed her suspicion into certainty. Christian Brueckner was not just a thief who stole diesel. He was the man in the shadows. He was the one who had entered apartment 5A. He was the reason the child was gone. The music pounded around her, but she felt a profound silence, the silence of a secret that was too heavy to carry. The days following the festival were filled with anxiety for Helga. Brueckner had vanished from the site, likely moving on to another town or crossing a border to put distance between himself and his mistake. Helga returned to her life, but the normalcy was gone. She carried the weight of the sentence with her. She knew that she held a key to the mystery that was tormenting the world, but she also knew the danger of holding that key. Brueckner was violent. She had seen the tapes. If he knew she was going to the police, her life would be worth nothing. However, the image of the missing child would not leave her. The posters were everywhere. The pleas from the parents were constant. Helga wrestled with her conscience. She was a criminal, yes, but she was not a monster. There was a line, and Brueckner had crossed it. After months of internal debate, fear warring with guilt, she made a decision. She would speak. It was late in 2008 when she finally worked up the courage to act. She did not go to the Portuguese police. She did not trust them, and the language barrier was a hurdle. Instead, she found a number for Scotland Yard in the United Kingdom. They were running a massive operation asking for information from anyone who had been in the Algarve at the time. Helga dialed the number. Her hands were shaking. She waited for a detective to answer, prepared to tell them everything about the farmhouse, the videotapes, the festival, and the sentence that Brueckner had spoken. But no detective answered. Instead, she was greeted by an automated system. The line was overwhelmed. Thousands of people were calling psychics with visions, tourists with vague memories, well-meaning people with useless theories. She waited for the beep. When it came, she spoke. She gave her name. She gave the name of Christian Brueckner. She said she had information about the man who took the child. She mentioned the confession at the festival. She spoke quickly, her voice tight with nerves, trying to fit the magnitude of her secret into the magnetic tape of a recording machine. She hung up her heart, racing, expecting a call back within hours. She waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The phone did not ring. Unbeknownst to Helga, her message had entered a chaotic abyss. The investigation was drowning in data. The task force was dealing with 60,000 pieces of information. In the sheer volume of noise, her voice was lost. Perhaps the recording was poor quality. Perhaps the translation was delayed. Perhaps it was simply filed away in a box marked low priority by an exhausted analyst who had listened to 500 calls that day. The tragedy of the lost voicemail was profound. At that moment in 2008, Brueckner was still in the region. He was reachable. The evidence at the farmhouse might still have been there. The memory of the festival was fresh, but the connection was never made. The system designed to catch the criminal had become a wall that protected him. Helga eventually stopped waiting. She assumed the police did not believe her or that they had investigated Brueckner and found nothing. She felt a mix of relief and despair. She had tried. She had done her duty. But the silence from London told her that her word was not enough. She buried the secret again, pushing it down deep. She went back to her life, looking over her shoulder, wondering if Brueckner would ever come back to silence her himself. Meanwhile, Christian Brueckner remained free. He continued his drift across Europe, committing other crimes, hurting other people, secure in the knowledge that his secret was safe. The investigation went cold. The parents continued their agonizing wait, and the truth lay dormant in a database, a digital ghost of a voice that had tried to solve the puzzle only to be ignored. It would take another 9 years before the phone would ring again, and by then the world had changed and the trail had gone ice cold. The years that followed the lost voicemail were defined by a suffocating silence. It was a silence that stretched across Europe from the sun-bleached streets of the Algarve to the gray industrial towns of Germany where Christian Brueckner had returned. The case of the missing child had transformed from an active investigation into a cold, immovable monument of grief. To the public, it was a tragedy without a resolution, a story that surfaced on anniversaries and then faded back into the white noise of the news cycle. But for the individuals connected to the truth, the silence was heavy with unsaid words and buried secrets. Brueckner moved through this decade with the confidence of a man who believed he had outrun his past. He did not live like a fugitive constantly looking over his shoulder. He lived like a man who had been exonerated by time. He continued his transient lifestyle, drifting between countries, committing crimes that were serious enough to land him in prison for short stints, but never significant enough to link him to the mystery in Portugal. He was a ghost in the system, a petty criminal whose file was thick with theft and drug offenses, but devoid of the one accusation that would have ended his freedom forever. For Helga Busching, the silence was a burden she carried alone. She had tried to speak. She had made the call. The failure of the authorities to respond had created a cynical resolve within her. She convinced herself that perhaps she was wrong, or perhaps the police simply did not care. She tried to push the memory of the videotapes and the conversation at the festival into the deepest recesses of her mind. She moved on with her life, distancing herself from the criminal circle she had once inhabited. She tried to become invisible, terrified that if she raised her head again, the man she feared would see her. But the memory was a parasite. It fed on the constant reminders in the media. Every time she saw a newspaper with the child's face, the sentence returned to her. She did not scream. It was a loop that played in her head, a reminder of a moral debt that remained unpaid. She knew that somewhere a family was still waiting for an answer, and she held a piece of that answer. The guilt was a slow poison eroding her peace of mind, but fear was a powerful antidote. Fear kept her mouth shut. Fear kept her from dialing the number again. During this period, the investigation itself was floundering. The Portuguese police had exhausted their leads. The British detectives were reviewing mountains of data, but without a specific direction. They were searching for a needle in a haystack that spanned a continent. They were looking for a stranger, a random vanishing, or a burglary gone wrong. They did not know that the name of their prime suspect was already sitting in a database buried under thousands of other useless tips. The disconnect between the information Helga possessed and the detectives who needed it was a tragedy of bureaucracy. Brueckner, meanwhile, was not entirely dormant. He spoke to others. The arrogance that had led him to confess to Helga at the festival did not disappear. There were other associates, other drinking partners, people to whom he dropped hints. He was testing the waters, perhaps seeking recognition for his infamy, or perhaps he was simply unable to contain the magnitude of what he had done. But these people, like Helga, were criminals. They lived by a code of silence. To go to the police was to betray their own kind. And so the whispers remained in the underworld, never reaching the light of the courtroom. The years rolled on: 2009, 2010, 2012. The child would have been growing up, but in the collective memory of the world, she remained 3 years old, frozen in time. The year 2017 marked a turning point. It was the 10th anniversary of the disappearance. The media coverage was intense, reigniting global interest in the case. The British government granted more funding for the investigation, signaling a renewed determination to close the book on the mystery. Documentaries were aired, timelines were reconstructed, and a fresh appeal for witnesses was launched. The message was clear: it is never too late to come forward. Helga Busching saw the appeals. She saw the pain on the faces of the parents, a pain that had not aged or diminished in a decade. Something in her resolve shifted. The fear of Brueckner was still there, but the weight of the secret had become heavier than the fear. She was older now. The recklessness of her past felt like a different lifetime. She realized that she could not go to her grave with this knowledge. She owed it to the child. She owed it to the truth. She found the number for the dedicated hotline again. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. She was not calling a generic switchboard overwhelmed by psychics and cranks. She was calling a team that was desperate for a credible lead. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling, just as it had 9 years earlier. She dialed. When the voice on the other end answered, Helga did not hesitate. She identified herself. She stated clearly that she knew who had taken the child. She gave the name Christian Brueckner. She told him about his van, his residence in the Algarve, and his history. But this time she added the details that made the detectives sit up in their chairs. She told them about the videotape she had found in the farmhouse. She told them about the conversation at the music festival in Spain. She repeated the sentence that had haunted her. She did not scream. The reaction was immediate. This was not a vague sighting of a man carrying a child. This was a witness who knew the suspect personally, who had seen evidence of his dark history, and who had heard a direct admission of knowledge regarding the crime. The British detectives working in conjunction with the German authorities realized they had stumbled upon the lead they had been waiting for. They arranged to meet her. The interview process was rigorous. They needed to verify her identity, her relationship with Brueckner, and her presence in Portugal at the time. Helga sat through days of questioning. It was exhausting. They probed her memory for every detail: the layout of the farmhouse, the make of the camera, the tone of Brueckner's voice, the specific words he used. They cross-referenced her story with facts she could not have known unless she was telling the truth. They asked her why she had waited so long. She told them about the voicemail in 2008. She told them about her fear. The detectives listened, their expressions grim. They realized the opportunity that had been missed, but they did not dwell on the past. They had her now. Her testimony was recorded, transcribed, and analyzed. It became the cornerstone of a new investigative strategy. The ghost had a name. The shadow in the Algarve was no longer a mystery. He was a target. With the name Christian Brueckner firmly in their sights, the investigation shifted gears from passive data collection to an active manhunt for evidence. The German federal police took the lead, bringing their resources to bear on the suspect's history. They began to dismantle his life piece by piece, looking for the connections that would place him at the scene of the crime. The first breakthrough came from the telecommunications data. The investigators went back to the raw data dumps from 2007, searching for a specific cell phone number that Brueckner had been using at the time. They found it. The data painted a chilling picture. On the night of the 3rd of May, 2007, Brueckner's phone had pinged off a mast in Praia de Luz. The analysis was precise. The phone was active in the area of the Ocean Club. At roughly 7:30 in the evening, just an hour before the vanishing window opened, he received a call. The conversation lasted for half an hour. The signal placed him within minutes of the apartment. He was not miles away in his farmhouse. He was right there in the dark, hovering on the perimeter of the resort. The timeline matched perfectly. Next, they looked at his vehicles. They traced the registration of the camper van and a Jaguar car he had been driving. They discovered a frantic attempt to change the registration of the car the day after the disappearance. Why would a man rush to change the paperwork of a vehicle less than 24 hours after a major crime unless he was trying to distance himself from it? It was a behavior that screamed of guilt, a panic move by a man who feared his car had been seen. The profile of Brueckner that emerged was that of the perfect suspect. He was not a random tourist. He was a local expert with a criminal mindset. He knew the layout of the Ocean Club because he had worked there. He knew which windows were vulnerable. He had a history of breaking into holiday apartments to steal. The detectives realized that his initial intent might have been burglary, a crime he had committed dozens of times. He might have entered the apartment looking for cash or electronics only to find the children asleep. But the darker side of the profile, the side revealed by Helga Busching's testimony about the videotapes, suggested a more sinister motive. He was a dangerous offender. The police dug into his German criminal record and found convictions for serious offenses against vulnerable individuals. The puzzle pieces locked together with a terrifying click. You had a man with the motive, the means, the opportunity, and the history. The former police chief who reviewed the new evidence was stunned. In all the years of the investigation, they had never had a suspect who fit the criteria so completely. Every other suspect had been circumstantial or easily ruled out. Brueckner was different. He was the best suspect because he was the only one who checked every single box. He was a drifter who lived in a van, making him difficult to track. He was a burglar who targeted resorts. He was a repeat offender. And he had confessed knowledge of the crime to an associate. The investigation was no longer a search. It was a construction of a legal case. They had to prove it. They knew he did it, but knowing and proving were two different things in a court of law. They needed to find the physical evidence that had been lost to time. They needed to find the van. They needed to find the other people he might have spoken to. But for the first time in 10 years, the detectives felt a surge of genuine hope. They were not chasing a phantom anymore. They were chasing a man who was currently sitting in a German prison for a drug offense, unaware that the net was finally closing in around him. The dots were connected and they formed the image of a face that Helga Busching had tried to forget, a face that was about to become the most hated in the world. The investigation had now moved beyond the search for a person and into the dissection of a method. To understand how a child could vanish from a secured apartment without a single scream being heard by the neighbors, the detectives had to dismantle the criminal mechanics of Christian Brueckner. They stopped looking at him merely as a suspect and began to study him as a system. What emerged was a pattern of behavior so consistent yet so adaptable that it explained the unexplainable voids in the timeline of that May evening. For years, the police had struggled with the lack of forensic evidence at the scene. There was no broken glass, no smashed door frame, no sign of a violent struggle in the living area. This absence of violence had led to wild theories about the parents or an inside job. But when the German prosecutors layered Brueckner's criminal history over the facts of the case, the silence of the crime scene stopped being a mystery and started being a signature. Brueckner was not a brute who kicked down doors. He was a creeper. He was a man who specialized in the art of quiet invasion. The profile constructed by the federal police revealed that Brueckner viewed the holiday resorts of the Algarve not as places of leisure, but as a vast unprotected warehouse of goods. He knew that tourists relaxed by the sun and wine shed their natural defenses. They left windows cracked open for air. They left patio doors unlocked while they sat by the pool. They assumed that the perimeter fence of a resort was a magic barrier against the real world. Brueckner exploited this specific psychological blind spot. His modus operandi was simple: wait for the occupants to leave, test the handles, and slip inside like a shadow. Investigators began to review dozens of cold cases involving burglaries in the region between 2005 and 2010. A chilling consistency appeared. Brueckner did not target the heavily fortified villas of the super-rich. He targeted the middle-tier holiday apartments, the ground-floor units that were easily accessible from the street but screened by shrubbery. He preferred the twilight hours or the dinner service window when the noise of the restaurants masked the sound of his movements. He would rifle through drawers for cash, passports, and jewelry and vanish before the main course was served. This context reshaped the narrative of the 3rd of May. The theory that solidified was terrifying in its banality. It suggested that Brueckner may not have gone to the Ocean Club that night with the primary intention of vanishing. He may have gone there to work. The apartment was situated perfectly for his needs: corner unit, ground floor, obscured view, wealthy British tourists. It was a prime target for a quick cash grab. The data placed him there, his phone active, his presence confirmed. The profilers hypothesized that he approached the apartment scanning for an open entry point. He found the window, or perhaps he found the patio door unlocked. The method of entry was less important than what happened next. The burglary gone wrong theory posited that he entered the apartment expecting it to be empty, or expecting the occupants to be deep in the other room. Instead, he found 3 sleeping children. In the mind of a common thief, this would be the moment to retreat. A burglar wants assets, not complications. But the detectives knew from Helga Busching's testimony and the videotapes that Brueckner was not a common thief. He possessed a dual pathology. He was a burglar, yes, but he was also a dangerous individual with a fixated interest in the vulnerable. The profiling team argued that when he stepped into that room and saw the child, the two halves of his criminal personality collided. The thief saw an opportunity to take something of value. The predator saw an opportunity to satisfy a dark, compelling urge. The split-second decision he made in that room changed the nature of the crime from a property offense to a life-altering tragedy. It explained the speed of the act. He did not need to plan a complex vanishing operation because he was already in the operational mode of a criminal. He was already full of adrenaline, already hyper-aware of his surroundings, already prepared to flee. The transition from taking an object to taking a person was a shift in target, not a shift in method. The "she did not scream" comment he made to Helga took on a new, horrifying dimension under this analysis. It suggested a level of interaction that was quiet, controlled, and immediate. It implied that he knew how to handle the situation, how to keep the situation quiet, or perhaps that the child was in a deep sleep, and he moved with such stealth that she never woke until it was too late. The absence of a struggle fit the profile of a man who knew how to move in the dark without knocking over a vase or bumping into a chair. Furthermore, his background as a mechanic and a handyman gave him a logistical advantage. He knew how windows worked. He knew how to manipulate the shutters of the specific architectural style found in Praia de Luz. A tourist might struggle with the heavy metal mechanisms creating noise. Brueckner would know exactly where to apply pressure to lift them silently. This technical competence was a force multiplier for his criminality. It turned physical barriers into mere inconveniences. The investigators also looked at his escape. A man carrying a child through the streets of a resort town takes a massive risk. But Brueckner was a master of blending in. He knew the back alleys. He knew the dirt tracks that cut through the scrubland paths that were not on the tourist maps. He had his vehicle nearby, likely the camper van or the Jaguar, parked in a spot that offered a quick exit onto the main road. The sighting by the family friend of a man walking calmly with a child aligned with Brueckner's profile. He would not run. Running attracts attention. He would walk with purpose, mimicking the behavior of a parent, using the social camouflage of the resort to hide in plain sight. The tragedy, as the detective saw it, was a perfect storm of opportunity and capability. If the window had been locked, he might have moved on to the next apartment. If the parents had returned 5 minutes earlier, he might have been scared off. But the timeline was precise. He had a window of minutes and he used every second of it. The police realized they were dealing with a criminal who was an opportunist in the worst sense of the word. He did not create the situation. He exploited it with a ruthlessness that was difficult for a normal mind to comprehend. Brueckner was not a supernatural entity who walked through walls. He was a man who tested Dr. handles. He was a man who watched from the shadows of the parking lot. He was a man who knew that paradise was soft and unsuspecting. The horror lay not in the complexity of his plan, but in the simplicity of it. He walked in, he took what he wanted, and he walked out. And because he had practiced this intrusion 100 times before on empty rooms, he executed it flawlessly on an occupied one. The pattern was there all along, buried in the police reports of stolen cameras and broken windows, waiting for someone to connect the petty thefts to the crime of the century. Now that the connection was made, the image of the drifter was replaced by the image of a shark swimming in a shallow pool, waiting for the water to be disturbed. The decision to speak is often portrayed as a moment of liberation, a shedding of a heavy burden, but for Helga Busching, the reality was a descent into a new kind of confinement. By identifying Christian Brueckner to the authorities, she had painted a target on her own back. She was no longer just a former associate of a drifter. She was now the primary threat to the freedom of a man who had demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence. The silence she had broken was replaced by a deafening roar of anxiety. Every shadow in her periphery, every unknown car parked on her street became a potential harbinger of retaliation. The German prosecutors knew that building a case for the disappearance of the British child would be a marathon. The evidence was circumstantial, the timeline was fragmented, and the physical traces had been eroded by the passage of a decade. However, Helga had given them something else, a weapon they could use immediately. She had described the videotape of the assault on the 72-year-old American woman, a crime committed in 2005. This was a cold case that had sat in the files of the Portuguese police unsolved and forgotten. But now, with Helga's testimony and the corroborating data they began to unearth, they had a pathway to a conviction. The strategy was ruthless but necessary. To ensure Brueckner remained behind bars while they hunted for evidence in the missing child case, they would prosecute him for the 2005 assault first. Helga became the linchpin of this strategy. She would have to stand in a courtroom, not in the shadows of an anonymous hotline, but in the harsh fluorescent light of a public trial. She would have to look the monster in the eye and point her finger at him. The journey to the trial was a psychological gauntlet. Helga was transported to Germany, effectively entering a protective bubble created by the state. Yet the protection of the police felt fragile against the terrifying certainty of her memories. She knew Brueckner's reach. She knew he had friends in the underworld, men who did not care about court orders or witness protection programs. The fear that he might orchestrate a hit from inside his prison cell was a constant gnawing presence in her mind. She slept fitfully, her dreams invaded by the image of the man in the black mask, the man who had laughed about the silence of a stolen child. When the day of the testimony arrived, the atmosphere in the courthouse was charged with a static tension. The media had descended on the location, sensing that this trial was the prelude to the main event. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashed, and the world watched, waiting for a glimpse of the man accused of the crime of the century. Helga was smuggled in through side entrances, shielded from the chaos, but she could feel the weight of the attention pressing against the walls. Entering the courtroom was like stepping into a vacuum. The air was stale and recycled. She walked to the witness stand, her legs feeling heavy and unresponsive, as if she were wading through deep water. She avoided looking at the dock, but she could feel his presence. It was a gravitational pull of pure malice. When she finally lifted her eyes, she saw him. Christian Brueckner sat behind the glass, flanked by his legal team. He looked different from the man she remembered at the festival. He was older, his face harder, but the eyes were the same. They were cold, assessing, stripped of any empathy. He stared at her, not with fear, but with an intensity that promised retribution. The defense team launched their attack immediately. Their strategy was predictable but brutal: destroy the credibility of the witness. They painted Helga not as a hero but as a criminal. They dragged her past into the light, dissecting her history of petty theft, her association with drug dealers, and her own legal troubles. They asked why the jury should trust the word of a woman who had lived on the fringes of society, a woman who admitted to breaking into the defendant's house to steal fuel. They accused her of lying for the reward money, of fabricating the story about the videotapes to save herself from prosecution. It was a dissection of her character designed to humiliate and break her. Helga sat in the chair, enduring the barrage of questions. Every mistake she had ever made was weaponized against her. The shame was a physical heat rising in her cheeks. But beneath the shame, there was a core of steel that the defense lawyers had underestimated. She was not doing this for money. She was not doing this for fame. She was doing this because she had heard a sentence that she could not forget. She was doing it because the image of the man taking off his mask in that video had haunted her for years. When the prosecutor asked her to recount what she had seen on the tape, the room went deadly silent. Helga's voice wavered, then steadied. She described the farmhouse. She described the chaos of the room. She described finding the camcorder. And then she described the footage. She spoke of the violence she had witnessed on the screen, the calculated cruelty of the man in the mask. She spoke of the moment he revealed his face, the moment the anonymity was stripped away to reveal Christian Brueckner. Her testimony was not polished, it was raw and terrified, and that is what gave it power. The jury could see that she was not reciting a script, she was reliving a nightmare. Brueckner remained impassive throughout her testimony, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. He knew that she was the loose thread that was unraveling his entire life. He had underestimated her. He had thought that a fellow thief would never talk, that the code of silence was absolute. He had been wrong. The cross-examination was grueling. The defense tried to trip her up on dates, on times, on the color of the camera, on the location of the tapes. They tried to confuse her, to make her doubt her own memory. But on the core facts, she remained immovable. She saw the tapes. She saw his face. She heard him speak about the child. The truth she discovered was a sturdy thing. It did not need to be embellished. It just needed to be held up to the light. When she was finally dismissed from the stand, she felt hollowed out. She had given everything she had. She had exposed herself to the world and to the man she feared most. She was escorted out of the courtroom back into the protective shadows, leaving the jury to decide the fate of the predator. The verdict, when it came, was a vindication. The court found Christian Brueckner guilty of the assault on the American woman. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. It was a victory, but a partial one. The sentence ensured that he would not walk free in the immediate future. It bought the investigators time, precious years, to build the case for Madeleine. But for Helga, the verdict did not bring peace. It brought a solidification of the threat. She had put him away, and he knew it. She returned to her life, but it was a life lived in a permanent state of high alert. She had done the right thing, but the cost was her own sense of safety. She knew that the man in the cell was stewing in his hatred, counting the days, perhaps planning. And she knew that the bigger battle was still to come. The trial for the assault was just the prologue. The questions about the missing child, about the sentence he had whispered at the festival, remained unanswered in the eyes of the law. She had struck the first blow, but the shadow in the Algarve was still long, and it still reached out to darken her door. The witness was safe for now, but in the world she inhabited, safety was always a temporary condition. The prison walls that held Christian Brueckner were made of concrete and steel, but to the investigators and the witnesses they felt terrifyingly fragile. He was incarcerated, serving a sentence for the assault on the American woman and for drug trafficking, but the calendar was moving relentlessly forward. Every day that passed was one day closer to his potential release, and one day less for the prosecutors to build the case that would keep him locked away for life. The situation had evolved into a high-stakes chess match between the German justice system and a defense team determined to exploit every procedural loophole to free their client. Inside the prison, Brueckner was far from silent. He adopted a posture of defiant victimhood. He wrote letters from his cell, communicating with the media and his supporters. In these letters, he strenuously denied any involvement in the disappearance of the British child. He mocked the prosecutors, calling the investigation a witch hunt driven by a desire for fame rather than justice. He portrayed himself not as a predator, but as a scapegoat, a man chosen simply because of his past, a convenient villain to pin a cold case on. His denial was absolute. He claimed he was miles away, that the phone data was misinterpreted, and that the witnesses were liars seeking reward money. For Helga Busching, watching this unfold from her hidden life was a form of psychological torture. She read his denials in the press, and they sickened her. She knew the truth of what she had seen on the videotapes. She remembered the cold certainty in his voice at the festival when he said the child did not scream. To her, his public proclamations of innocence were the final insult to the victims. She felt a growing sense of dread that the system was going to fail her. She had come forward, she had testified, she had put her life on the line, and yet the possibility remained that he could walk free. "I do not believe him," she told her confidants. "He knows what I saw. He knows it." The legal battle was complex. The German prosecutors publicly stated they had concrete evidence that the child was dead and that Brueckner was responsible. However, they admitted they did not yet have enough evidence to secure a conviction in court. It was a terrifying paradox. They knew he did it, but they could not prove it to the standard required by law. They lacked the body. They lacked the DNA at the scene. They lacked a confession on record. They were building a puzzle where the central piece was still missing, and they were running out of time. The tension reached a fever pitch when Brueckner's defense team launched a challenge against his current sentence. They argued that his extradition from Italy to Germany had been legally flawed, suggesting he could only be tried for the specific drug offenses mentioned in the warrant, not the severe assault. For a few heart-stopping weeks, it looked as though a technicality might open the prison gates. The prospect of Christian Brueckner walking out of jail, a free man, sent shockwaves through the investigation. If he was released, he would likely vanish again. He would disappear into the borders of Europe, and the chance to bring him to justice for the disappearance would be lost forever. The investigators had to pivot. If they could not charge him with the take-a-life yet, they had to find other reasons to keep him incarcerated. They began to scour his past with even greater intensity. They looked for other victims. They reopened files on other unsolved attacks in the Algarve. They found cases of other assaults, other flashings, other burglaries. The strategy was to build a preventative detention case to prove that he was a danger to the public and could never be released regardless of the Madeleine McCann verdict. This shift in strategy acknowledged a grim reality: the case of the missing child might never be fully solved in a way that satisfied a jury. The evidence might have been destroyed in the 18 years since the event. The van might have been scrubbed clean. The body might never be found. But if they could prove he was a serial predator, they could achieve the same result, keeping him behind bars. For the parents of the missing girl, this period was an agony of uncertainty. They had lived for nearly 2 decades with the hope of finding their daughter, or at least finding the truth. Now they were watching a legal game where their daughter's name was just a file among many. They maintained their dignity and their hope, releasing statements that they would never give up. But the looming release of the prime suspect cast a long shadow over their lives. It forced them to confront the possibility that the man who took her might never answer for that specific crime. Helga Busching's faith in the German justice system began to erode. She saw a system that seemed more concerned with the rights of the criminal than the safety of the witness. She expressed her fear that if he was released, he would come for her. She knew he was a vengeful man. The protection she had been promised felt thin. She stated that perhaps the English police should take over the case, hoping that a different jurisdiction might have more power or more will to close the net. As the months ticked by, the pressure on the prosecutor's office in Braunschweig was immense. They were under the microscope of the global media. Every decision was analyzed. Every delay was criticized. They were working against a criminal who was resourceful and a defense team that was aggressive. The narrative had shifted from who did it to can we hold him. Brueckner was still in his cell, but the door was unlocked. The prosecutors were scrambling to pile enough legal weight against it to keep it shut. Helga was watching the news every night, waiting for the announcement she dreaded most. And somewhere in the dark machinery of the legal system, the fate of the investigation was being decided. The looming release was not just a procedural event, it was a moral crisis. If a man like Christian Brueckner could walk free after everything that was known, then the concept of justice itself seemed to be broken. The world waited, holding its breath to see if the law would protect the innocent or liberate the guilty. The passage of time is usually a mechanism for healing a slow erosion of sharp edges until memory becomes soft and manageable. But in the case of the child who vanished from the Ocean Club, time has acted differently. It has not healed the wound. It has preserved it. 18 years have passed since that night in May 2007. A generation has grown up in the shadow of the posters, the age progression sketches, and the relentless theories. The child who was just a toddler when she was taken would now be a young woman in her 20s. She would be living a life defined by university careers and relationships. Instead, she remains frozen in the collective consciousness as a toddler in a pink hat, a static image that refuses to age. For the parents, the 18 years have been a marathon of resilience. They have lived through the initial shock, the suffocating suspicion directed at them by the media and the Portuguese police, the false leads, the imposters claiming to be their daughter, and the crushing disappointments of DNA tests that came back negative. They have faced the world with a dignity that is almost unfathomable, holding on to a singular hope that somewhere, somehow, there is an answer. They have never stopped searching. They have never stopped asking the question that haunts every parent's nightmare: what happened in the dark while we were just meters away? Christian Brueckner remains the dark center of this orbit. He sits in his cell, a man who has become the personification of the mystery. To the German prosecutors, he is not a question mark. He is a period at the end of a sentence. They are convinced of his guilt. They have stated publicly that they believe the child is no longer alive, and that Brueckner is the man responsible for her fate. They have the phone data placing him at the scene. They have the history of breaking into holiday apartments. They have the Jaguar car he rushed to re-register. And they have the witness Helga Busching, who heard him speak the words that only the perpetrator could know. Yet as the years roll on, the legal closure remains elusive. The gap between knowing and proving is a canyon that the justice system struggles to bridge without a body or a confession. Brueckner continues to deny everything. He plays the game of the wrongfully accused, writing letters that mix arrogance with victimhood. He knows that without physical evidence, without a strand of hair, a fingerprint, or a biological trace linked directly to the vanishing, he holds a powerful card. He holds the truth hostage. He is the only person alive who knows the exact sequence of events that unfolded in apartment 5A, and he has chosen to take that secret to his grave if necessary. The shadow of suspicion that follows him is permanent. Even if he is eventually released, even if the legal maneuvers of his defense team succeed in opening the prison gates, he will never be free of this case. He will walk into a world that knows his face and knows his history. He will be watched. He will be tracked. The anonymity he once used as a weapon in the Algarve is gone forever. He is no longer the invisible drifter. He is the man who the world believes stole a child. For Helga Bushing, the resolution is equally complex. She did what she could. She broke the code of silence that governs the criminal underworld. She stood up in court and pointed the finger. She carries the weight of the, what if. What if she had been listened to in 2008? What if the voicemail had not been lost? Would the outcome have been different? Would the family have been spared a decade of torture? These are questions without answers, but her testimony stands as the pivotal moment when the ghost was finally given a name. She lives with the fear of retaliation, but also with the knowledge that she did not let the secret die with her. The case has changed the way the world views safety. It destroyed the illusion of the safe holiday resort. It taught a generation of parents that danger does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a mechanic in a camper van, a man who fixes cars and smiles at tourists while harboring dark intention. The legacy of the disappearance is a loss of innocence for millions of people who realize that a life can be dismantled in the space of a few minutes in the silence of an unlocked room. As the sun sets over the Algarve today, the streets of Praia de Luz look much the same as they did 18 years ago. The tourists still come. The ocean still crashes against the rocks. The restaurants still serve dinner to families on the terrace. But the air is different. There is a memory etched into the landscape. The apartment where it happened is no longer just a rental unit. It is a monument to the vanished. People walk past it and lower their voices. They look at the window, the shutter, the patio door, and they replay the scenario in their minds. The ending of this story has not yet been written in a courtroom verdict. It may never be. There may never be a moment where a judge reads out a sentence for the tragic disappearance of Madeleine McCann. The case may remain legally in the gray area of unsolved. But in the court of truth, the pieces have fallen into place. The narrative constructed by the investigator, supported by the profiling and the witness testimony, tells a coherent and terrifying story. It tells of a predator who saw an opportunity, a man who slipped through a window and stole a life, leaving behind nothing but silence. The final haunting thought is the sentence that started the unraveling of the mystery. She did not scream. It is a sentence that echoes through the 18 years of investigation. It implies a moment of contact, a moment of control, and a tragic finality. It is the sentence that convinced a witness to turn on her associate. It is the sentence that convinces the prosecutors they have the right man. And it is the sentence that lingers in the minds of the public, a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of a child in the face of a determined darkness. The search continues not just for evidence, but for peace. The parents continue to hope. The police continue to dig. And Christian Brueckner continues to wait in his cell, the keeper of the secret, the shadow in the Algarve who walked away into the night and left the world asking why for nearly 2 decades. The mystery remains, but the darkness is no longer empty. It has a face and it has a name. The story of the vanishing is a tragedy without an end, a book with the final page torn out, leaving us to stare into the silence and wonder if justice will ever truly catch up to the man who knows the truth.